I want to thank you for joining us for this Wednesday evening service of First Baptist Church in Lucedale, Mississippi. The title of tonight's message is A Future and a Hope. Those words are some of my favorite words in the Bible. You'll find those words in that wonderful promise God makes in Jeremiah 29:11. But you will never find them pictured more beautifully than in the little book of Ruth. For those of you who've been with us on our journey, you know that for the past 4 weeks, we've been focusing on hope in the book of Ruth. The story begins with how one family loses hope in a time of famine because a man named Elimelech lost his hope in God. He stepped outside the will of God, moving his family to the land of Moab. What was meant to be a short stay outside the will of God turned into more than a decade. He died, leaving his family outside the will of God. Later, his sons would also step outside the will of God by marrying Moabite women. Then his sons died, leaving their mother and their widowed wives outside the will of God in the land of Moab. Ultimately, Naomi hears the news that the Lord has provided bread for his people, but she is outside the will of God in the land of Moab. But she makes a move toward God and returns to Bethlehem, yet without hope. She confessed, "I went out full, but the Lord brought me back empty." In making that confession, she was directly acknowledging the Lord's discipline in her life, but also indirectly acknowledging the Lord's hand in bringing her back to Bethlehem. Prayerfully, you also have recognized some of those moments when you and your family stepped outside the will of God. You realize that as God was at work behind the scenes in the life of Naomi, He has often been at work behind the scenes in your life to redeem your circumstances. Naomi was not the only woman in the story without hope. Ruth, the Moabitess, was also without hope. She was without hope because Moabites were strictly forbidden from entering the assembly of the Lord. She was without hope because her husband was dead. But although she was without hope, she came to Bethlehem seeking to find refuge in the God of Israel. Perhaps she had heard of His mercy and of His might or of His love. She came to Bethlehem groping for hope. Last week we considered how, in the providence of God, she met a man named Boaz, whose name means "in him is strength." I showed you how Boaz is a picture of the Lord Jesus Christ. Of course, Ruth didn't know that. She didn't even know all that God was doing in and around her life and how He was using her story to bring a message of hope to people like you and me. Tonight, we finish the story, or we might say that we come to the end of the beginning of the future and the hope that God planned not only for Ruth and Naomi, but for all the world. I sincerely hope I haven't wearied you with our journey, but we can't leave the story without taking a closer look at the 4th chapter. I shared with you last week the meaning of the word goel. This is the Hebrew word behind the word, depending on your translation, in chapter 4, verse 2, the word translated perhaps kinsman or nearest kinsman, our nearest relative, our redeemer, our family redeemer. This was the person who had the right, if they also had the resources, to buy back what a poor brother sold or lost and couldn't recover. The person could also purchase property belonging to a man who died and was next of kin, and marry his widow and raise up children in the name of that man. But this is not just a word used of a person. Isaiah used the word 13 times in the book of Isaiah to refer to God as one who redeemed and restored. The biblical concept of hope never rests in the present, but always extends to a future beyond what we can see or experience in this life. First, because hope is a person, our hope rests not in what we can accomplish for ourselves, but in what He can accomplish in our behalf. If you remember, all Ruth could do was lay herself at the feet of Boaz and wait to see what he would do. Naomi assured her that he would waste no time in attending to the matter of her need and their collective need as a family. You see his activity as you turn to chapter 4, beginning to read in verse 1. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the Redeemer, the Goel, of whom Boaz had spoken, came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, the Goel, this other man who also had an opportunity to do the same thing Boaz was about to do, he said, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." Then Boaz said, "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." The Redeemer said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it." Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," he drew off his sandal. There are several things here that I want to show you about Boaz. First, Boaz acted legally. The city gate was equivalent to the courthouse lawn as a gathering place, but with the 10 elders gathered, it was a kind of civil court setting. Everything you see here was standard legal process, including the guy who turned down the opportunity, removing his sandal. Not only did Boaz act legally, Boaz also acted logically. He laid the matter out in a fashion which showed the other person's haste to cash in on the opportunity to buy a little land. But he also exposed the other guy's unwillingness to get involved with a Moabite woman. Perhaps there was some risk to his own descendants' rights in this process, or perhaps the matter was all about Ruth as a foreigner. After hearing of his obligation to marry Ruth, he pulls away from the opportunity. The removal of his sandal was the formal refusal. Not only did Boaz act legally and logically, Boaz also acted lavishly. Look at verse 9. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day." So Boaz paid the price. He redeemed the property, paying whatever debts were against it. He bought the property from Naomi, but he also bought Ruth. She was purchased as his wife. There is something not so romantic about that idea. You will not find it said even once in this book that Boaz loved Ruth, but he paid the price that was necessary. He acted lavishly. But I suggest to you that Boaz also acted lovingly. Allow me to show you another picture of the heart of God toward those who are unworthy. Remember, Ruth knew this about herself, that she was unworthy, referring to herself the way everyone else referred to her, as a foreigner. In the book of Hosea, Hosea the prophet is instructed to marry an unworthy woman. She is a prostitute when he marries her. He was to love her as a picture of God's love for his own unworthy, unfaithful people. But during their marriage, she becomes a prostitute again and winds up sold into slavery. God speaks to Hosea, calling him to go again and love her. Hosea had to purchase his own wife out of slavery. He did so because he loved her, but it was also a picture of how God works to redeem people who are unworthy and unfaithful. Ruth was unworthy, but Boaz purchased her. He acted in a Christ-like manner. He redeemed her lovingly. I also want you to see that Boaz acted to build a legacy. A legacy is all about the future and not at all about the present. A legacy is something you will never see. It is for those who live after you. His actions not only brought hope to Ruth and Naomi in the present, his actions spawned hope for the distant future. Immediately, the people present in the story are reminded of another moment when God redeemed the story of another unworthy woman. Look at verse 11. Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephratah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman." The unworthy woman in those verses is a woman named Tamar. She, you might remember, was married to one of Judah's sons. The son died, and then another married her. He also died. Both of them died at the hands of the Lord, not due to Tamar. But Judah was skeptical. He withheld his other son from her, and she was left a hopeless widow. She posed as a prostitute on the side of the road, disguising herself. Judah saw her. He used her. He abandoned her. She was pregnant. When he found out his daughter-in-law was pregnant, he wanted to kill her, not knowing who the father might be. But if you know the story, she slyly asked him in their rendezvous to leave some of his possessions with her as a pledge. He pledged her a goat, I suppose in payment for her services. But when he returned with the goat, she was gone. But she kept what he left as evidence. When he decided to have her killed, she brought out the evidence of who the father was. Maybe you don't know that story. She eventually gave birth to twins. The firstborn of those twins was Perez. Perez turns out to be the great-great-great-grandfather of the grandfather of Boaz. As God redeemed Tamar's story, he was now at work to redeem Ruth and build a legacy, not just for Boaz, but for Naomi. The second major point in this story is this: because hope is a person, we lose all our unworthiness by our connection to him. Who is Ruth in this story? I remind you that she is referred to 7 times in 4 chapters as either a Moabite or a Moabite woman. Once she refers to herself as a foreigner. Who does she become once she marries Boaz? Look at verse 13, the first part of the verse. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. Now, you may not notice anything different about that, but you will see that she is no longer called Ruth the Moabite or a Moabite woman. She's no longer an outcast. She came to seek refuge under the wings of the God of Israel. She has become one of his people by virtue of her connection to Boaz. There is no more beautiful picture to me in all the Bible than that moment. She takes her place among the people of God and her place in the plan that God has for her life. She now has a future and a hope. She found it in Boaz. But for those of us who read her story, we see how God was at work behind the scenes to bring her to the moment of her redemption. What is God doing in your life? Do you find yourself in a period of hopelessness and despair? Does God have a plan? Can God make a way? Does he have a future and a hope for you? Can he redeem your missteps and your mistake and your journeys outside the will of God? Can He bring hope to your hopelessness? Ruth's story is not only about the future and the hope that He planned for Ruth. It's really all about the future and the hope He has planned for you. Now look at verse 13 again. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went in to her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life, and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Then Naomi took the child, and laid him on her lap, and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, A son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. The final major point in our story of Ruth is because hope is a person. He will not leave you without hope at any moment in your life. He always has a plan to give you a future and a hope. I told you at the beginning that although this book is called the Book of Ruth, it is really all about what God was doing behind the scenes in Naomi's life. Remember, early on, she voices her own hopelessness. She realized that by stepping outside the will of God, she lost all hope. She can't see how God could ever restore all she lost. Her property was lost, but God restored it by providing a redeemer in the person of Boaz. Her husband was lost, and her sons were lost, leaving her without hope for a future or a legacy for her family. But look at what happened. It was something only God could do. Remember those ladies as they watched Naomi walking back into town? They said, Is this Naomi? She was so wretchedly hopeless and bedraggled that they hardly recognized her. She said, Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara, which means bitterness. But now those same ladies exclaimed, Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. Why did they say that? Did they say that because she had her property back? No. They said that because of the little baby she was holding in her lap. It was of him, they said, He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. They recounted what God had done in her life, even though she stepped outside the will of God, and how God caused all things to work together for good. They said, For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. But it was not just Ruth who loved Naomi. Who loved Naomi? God loved Naomi. Why was God at work to show his love to Naomi? Why was God at work to give hope to Naomi? Why did God work to restore Naomi's future? He did all of that because he also has a plan to do that for you. He was working his plan in her life because he also wants to work his plan in your life. So in spellbound wonder, Naomi did what any grandmother would do. In verse 16 we read, Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. If you have doubts that it was all about Naomi, look at how the women even recognized this as God's redeeming work. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, A son has been born to Naomi. This son was born to raise up the name of Naomi's son, Mahlon. It was a miracle worked by the wonder of God's grace. But this is not the end of the story. As I told you earlier, this is only the end of the beginning as God continues to work his plan of redemption. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David, in Ruth 4:17. The name Obed, by the way, means worshiper. Do you suppose this little boy who lay in the lap of Naomi, who is now so full of praise for what God had done for her, do you suppose his little heart was shaped to be a worshiping heart? Do you suppose that his worshiping heart had any part in shaping the heart of his grandson, a young boy whose name was David, who became a man after God's own heart? Of course, all this time, through what God was doing in and through his plan, God was working to bring a future and a hope to Naomi. But he was also working to bring a future and a hope to you through a descendant of Naomi, the Lord Jesus Christ. What he did for her was above and beyond all that she could ask or imagine. How could you think that his plan is to do anything less for you? I hope you've enjoyed the book of Ruth. I hope that you will discover the future and the hope that God has for you. Thank you so much for listening.